And welcome back to Inside Olympia. In our first half, we heard from newly elected Speaker of the House, Jenkins, about her priorities for the 2020 session. Joining me now is House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox. Welcome back to the program. Good to see you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Austin.
So only 2 weeks in, but sort of a sense of where things are going, how they're going, the state of affairs from your perspective in the minority.
Okay, well, 2 weeks in means about 20% done, so that's kind of good to see.
In a short 60-day session, it does go by quickly.
It really does. I tell people it's an absolutely breakneck pace, and if you don't get a hearing on your bill right away, then you're not going to have a bill at the end of the time. Well, speaking of breakneck, I am seeing all kinds of people wandering around the Capitol with a faraway look in their eye because they just can't keep up with the bill introductions. And the numbers that I've seen on the new introductions, I don't think I've ever seen numbers those high. And so it's a little bit hard to tell, you know, which ones are serious, which ones aren't. In the minority, you don't set the agenda, so you have to take them all seriously, as do the citizens and the lobbyists that are often the targets of these bills. But I have heard a little bit of dismay from our housing people that feel like part of the reason that we don't have the housing that we need is because we've made it hard for the private sector to operate, that we're seeing further attacks on the private sector. I think a rent control bill was just dropped after assurances for a year that that wasn't coming. And so there's a lot of concern in that arena. We are through some of the contentious hearings. We've seen big crowds come in and talk about gun rights. We've seen big crowds come in and talk about the comprehensive sex education. And now, you know, it's really a matter of waiting to see what the committee chairs decide to exec out. And that'll tell us what the session's going to be about.
It is interesting and notable that housing and homelessness, it was a trending issue last year, it felt like, but now it does seem like it's a front and center issue for this short session. There are a lot of bills and ideas from the Republican side in both the House and Senate, as well as from majority Democrats. Help us understand what's driving that. I mean, I know that the polling shows it's top of mind to voters, but it's interesting to me that this is so quickly kind of cemented itself as a top issue on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, House and Senate Republicans have been warning about the crisis in being able to build housing for many, many years. And
this is going back to the Growth Management Act, probably.
Well, that's true. And, you know, it's become apparent that that's broken in two ways. First of all, it made it really difficult to pursue business opportunities outside of the cities so that people that lived in the smaller towns and smaller cities could actually be employed where it's affordable to live. And at the same time, it made it really, well, let me rephrase. I don't think that the cities lived up to the need of opening up ground so that people could build either more single family dwellings or multifamily dwellings. So for us, this has been a slow-moving catastrophe. And after 10 years down here in Olympia, I'm really tired of watching us break things. And I think we broke the housing system over the last 10 years, and we've broken some other things. So, you know, we think that there's a couple of different ways to approach this. There is addressing the immediate need, which has to happen fast, and I think our Representative Drew Stokesbury has dropped a bill that provides kind of a starting point for a discussion. I don't know that every member of either party is going to be happy with that, but at the same time, you know, we have got to let the private sector solve this problem. For the entire history of the United States, the private sector has provided the vast majority of the housing. And it can do it again if we let it happen.
That proposal would allow some additional taxing authority on the part of local governments in trade for some restrictions around homeless encampments, safe injection drug sites. Let me just take you back around the housing point. I remember distinctly during the height of the housing crisis, during the Great Recession, driving out your way towards Yelm, and there were housing developments out there that had been abandoned. Half or a quarter built, they just walked away. So how much of it really is about regulation and how much of it is about the economy, if you will? Because back then they did have land to turn and to build houses, but obviously the market, the bottom fell out. So the complexity of this issue and where we find ourselves today. I mean, it seems in many ways like we are victims of just a very good economy, and the fact that we've got a lot of people moving here, got these tech companies, these big six-figure salaries, they've driven up the cost of living. That seems to be what's really driven this crisis.
Yeah. Well, we've been seeing, first of all, it sounds a little funny to be a victim of a hot economy, but I do see what you're saying. The developments that you talked about have been built out now, and you know, part of the problem
People
is
came back to them.
Yeah, we build out in smaller towns where it's affordable to build housing, but we haven't worked on the small town economy so that people have a place to work there. And so, you know, you really turn these towns into commuter and bedroom communities, which creates a transportation problem. And for the last 8 years, probably, the number one concern that you hear from people that build is they don't have, you know, what they call buildable dirt. And so I think there's been a strong desire to add to the amount of housing that we have, but the slow pace of approval and the lack of zoning policies, and also a regulatory environment that makes the lead time so long has really made a big impact. And you know, I think everybody is acknowledging that now, because you're seeing bills that say, let's suspend some of the regulatory environment for low-income housing or shelters, for example.
So that you could speed up the construction.
Right.
So, but getting back to then this kind of dual complexity, you talk about the lack of affordable housing, which obviously is a key factor in the homelessness situation, but then the lack of jobs in more rural communities. I mean, absolutely, the bulk of the jobs and the people are going to central Puget Sound, and specifically, you know, 30 miles or 20 miles in either direction of downtown Seattle. So you could allow more building of homes, say in your district, but those people would be then commuting probably to their jobs. How do you start to address, what could Republicans do? What would Republicans do if you were in charge to start to bring jobs back to more rural parts of Washington?
Well, again, these are things that have been proposed for a long time, and sometimes we make slow progress on these, sometimes we make no progress. One of the number one infrastructure complaints that people have is that we have so little broadband capacity in these areas. But I also think that, and this kind of goes back to my experience in the 90s mostly, working on siting processing plants around the Northwest. Every kind of business needs some sort of infrastructure. If it's a high-tech business, a lot of times they need just an immense amount of broadband. If it is a processing or manufacturing business, they may need better access to freeways. Or, and this is the case when I've done this in my life, you may need a high-capacity, modern waste handling system, as well as all of the water that is necessary sometimes to do food processing. And we just don't have that out on the rural and the small town landscape. And I would love to see us trying to provide those infrastructures, because the truth is people will come if you have them. And especially, you know, the years that we spent trying to resolve some of our water issues in Hearst, I think really delayed the ability of small towns to develop, both in terms of housing and in terms of their ability to attract employers.
This was the Supreme Court decision around wells. Okay. Let me just take you back then to the 60 days here. Because of the differences in philosophy around what the solutions might look like specific to affordable housing and homelessness, what realistically do you think might come out of a short session? The governor, of course, has said that he wants to drive down the number of unsheltered homeless people by half over the next couple of years by tapping the Rainy Day Fund. A controversial idea, I think, for both Democrats and Republicans. But let's just do a reality check here. What can reasonably be done, if anything?
Well, I think that Stokesbury's bill has a chance of bringing people from both sides in. Just to go back to your description of it, in keeping with the philosophy that we have, is if you're going to have taxes, they have to be voted on by the people. His bill allows, you know, any local government to decide how are they going to approach this, how big of an emergency is it going to be, and you know, put some parameters around it, because we know that the easy availability of opioids actually contributes to homelessness. But most importantly, it says the local governments can begin a process, but the voters really have to speak on what they're going to do and how they're going to fund it. That's something that's pretty bedrock important for us. It's up to local voters to decide what's going to happen to their tax dollars and how many they're going to provide.
There seems like there is tension around kind of in philosophy about how to approach and manage the homelessness crisis. And I'm hearing from Republicans terms like we need more of a law and order approach, more of a carrot and a stick, more accountability, more requiring people to go into treatment, not just letting them avail themselves of it if it's what they want at that moment. Can you give us a little insight into where Republicans are coming from kind of philosophically as you look at the tent encampments and look at the visible homelessness?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that you asked earlier, why is this of interest to both parties and at such a high priority level right now? I think it's because in a odd and kind of sad way, homelessness is something that unites the state right now. It used to be, we thought at least, whether it was right or wrong, that it was a big city problem. And it's a every size fits all problem now. It doesn't matter where you live, you see this. And when you tie it to addiction and what feels to most people like increasing crime, it touches almost every family out there. And so I think every Republican thinks you can't just look at one piece of it. You can't just provide housing with no strings attached, for example. And if you have compassion, you will provide some discipline that people under those conditions often don't have themselves. And so if it was my child or my brother out there, I wouldn't want the thing that is tearing his life apart to be promoted, and enabled. And I think there's an awful lot of people that agree with that, even those who do have family members that are involved in that crisis. And I also want to say, we have members in our caucus who have experienced this in their immediate family and have been very public about the way that it tears their family apart. And they are often the people that are most insistent. We have great compassion, and because we have compassion, we don't want to enable this thing that is creating such a self-destructive cycle.
Let me just, before we move on to another topic, ask you kind of, regardless of where the money would come from, again, the governor's proposal is to tap the rainy day fund. How realistic is it to think that the state, in the supplemental year, that the legislature would come up with $100 million or $200 million and program that money out with a specific focus on building more shelter beds and trying to reduce the unsheltered homeless?
Well,
how in play is that idea?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a difference between, what's possible and what's likely. And, having come off a budget year when we had record revenues, record increases in revenue, and record new taxes passed, if this was a priority, absolutely it could be funded. Now, politics is the art of the possible, and I'm not in the majority, and the majority decided that this wasn't the priority for them, even though all of those new resources were available. Having been someone who came here mainly to do budgets in the past, I really think hard about bow waves, which is what are you doing today that's going to create budget problems in the future? And the major objection that I would have to the governor's approach here is you take these dollars that were put away during the best years that we've ever had economically and in terms of revenue, create programs. Some of it's one-time money for one-time expenses, but most of it, I think, is for ongoing programs. And you immediately create a budget challenge in the future that will be turned into a crisis, and we will need to raise taxes on people in the middle of a recession when they can least afford it. And that doesn't seem like a way to solve a problem for me. It sounds more like a way to create a problem.
Okay. You mentioned the gun-related bills that got hearings, big crowds. There was a rally last week, a gun rights rally on the steps of the Capitol. Democrats have heard a bill that's backed by the governor and the attorney general to ban so-called assault weapons. That doesn't seem like it's likely to move this year, despite the hearing. But a bill that majority Democrats are talking more bullishly, if you will, about passing is a limit on magazine capacity. just out of the gates, a very simple question. Can you imagine any Republicans joining with Democrats to support limits on magazine capacity?
I think that is very, very unlikely, and I'll give you a few reasons. First of all, that bill is the one that intrudes on the rights of the most people, you know, the most commonly owned weapons, especially by people that want to provide for their own self-protection in suburban areas, are the most, you know, common pistols that have more than 10 rounds in their magazine. This touches just about anybody that wants to exercise their Second Amendment and Washington State constitutional rights. So I think that there will be a lot of public consternation when people that might ordinarily listen with some sympathy to this understand that it immediately makes what they think is their right to protect themselves illegal in the future. That doesn't make sense to me. These are the most law-abiding people, and they're the ones that might comply.
Is there something that you think this legislature, the tension around this issue is not going to go away, and it's not new. But there is obviously a lot of concern about mass shootings. In a bipartisan fashion, the legislature has looked at how to reduce school shootings and come up with bipartisan recommendations there. Is there anything around restricting access to firearms or particular firearms that are often, you know, the AR-15 has become sort of the poster gun for school shootings. Is there anything that you think this state, and I understand our Constitution, when it comes to the right to bear arms, is even more forceful than the U.S. Constitution. Yeah. Is there anything we can or should be doing vis-a-vis access to firearms? Yeah,
you know, I'm glad you pointed out that the Washington State Constitution, from that perspective, is very strong. You know, we just had a couple of examples in the state of Washington, and on a much larger scale, the state of Virginia, where you had tens of thousands of people show up, no disturbances, no injuries. They picked up the trash and left the state capitol grounds looking better than it did when they got there. Law-abiding gun owners are not the problem, and I'll mention a member of the press, a prominent member of the press recently, Dave Ross. I was listening to him yesterday. Nobody would call Dave Ross a right-wing extremist, but he was talking about these gun bills, and he made the point several times, well, doesn't this prove, talking about Virginia, for example, doesn't this prove that it's not the weapon that's the problem, it's the person who might wield it that's the problem? And why don't we work on addressing the problems that turn people into people that are careless with whatever weapon it is?
Okay. I will note that there is a bipartisan bill to move to a centralized background check system in the state that's co-sponsored by one of your caucus members, Morgan Irwin, that we require local law enforcement to do the pistol checks and now the semi-automatic rifle checks. Down in Oregon, state police do it. What kind of momentum do you see around getting that through in a short session?
Well, I think that there's quite a bit of momentum, but that doesn't mean that things happen.
Yeah.
You know, if it gets sidetracked, it's gone. And that is really to address the fact that the initiative created a system that is chaotic and is one more unfunded mandate on, you know, parts of local government and isn't working very well. So I hope that we do get that one fixed.
Okay. Let me ask you a little bit about, you're not in charge, you're not in the majority, but and obviously the new Speaker of the House has talked about how she wants to manage the House and manage what gets to the floor. I want to ask, just sort of, again, it's really early, but are you sensing any change under Speaker Jenkins? Are your members getting any more of their bills heard? What's happening kind of behind the scenes?
Well, I think it's a little early to know that. You know, there always is a fair amount of cooperation behind the scenes. I've said for years, since I spent 6 years as a floor leader, there's like three caucuses. There's the House Republicans, the House Democrats, and then the floor leaders. And the floor leaders are there to kind of resolve some of the differences behind the scenes so that the good bills, which are the majority of the bills that come to the floor, are passed, the amendatory process works, and that's working as it has in the past. And I've had good congenial leadership meetings between our leadership and their leadership. But you always hit the most contentious bills, and you know, it's your job as the minority to stand up for the interests of our voters. And I've said many times that nobody votes for a House Republican because they want them to come to Olympia and give up. You know, our job is to oppose as effectively as possible when we find the things that are just not compatible with our principles and the values of the people that sent us here. So we're going to have those conflicts. You have to get through them. You know, government isn't designed to collapse because you have contentious issues. And I think that we're going to find out how it works with this new leadership. And let me just say, we've had an immense turnover in 3 of the 4 corners. I think I've been a caucus leader for about 20 months now, and I'm the second most senior in the building. So everybody is trying to figure out, you know, in what ways are we going to be different going forward?
It's a good point. There are a lot of new members, a lot of fresh faces. It is a newer legislature, newer house in many ways. Is there, I know at City Club events, you're often asked, you know, 3 bills that should pass, 3 bills that should not pass. I won't ask you for that list, but is there something that you are seeing Democrats teeing up or the governor teeing up that absolutely is, it's your mission to make sure it doesn't get through in 60 days?
Well, I think I've mentioned a couple of those already. First of all, rent control has not worked anywhere. We were told that it wasn't going to come up. Andrew Barkus, one of our housing leads, told me yesterday that it had been dropped. We don't need to do things that will make it less likely that the private sector comes in and replaces this housing that is needed. As you know, there was a study recently that said that over the last, I think, 10 years, we are short 225,000 new housing units. And so that bill, plus whatever it is that is being proposed that's going to make it less likely that people are going to invest in housing, is a huge disaster for the state, and we don't want any of those things to pass. And last year, some of the most contentious debates, and the ones that were most full of ideology, occurred over housing things. So that's going to be important. We've talked about gun bills, and you know, you start every term raising your hand and swearing to uphold the laws and the Constitution of the state of Washington and the United States. And we're not going to go along with things that we feel are unconstitutional there. And then some things that we do want.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I think we feel very strongly that we have created, in some cases, kind of an untenable situation for law enforcement. And when you are elected and serve, you end up going to way too many funerals for law enforcement professionals, and way too many of those people are killed on the job, but you also have an awful lot that leave the profession due to stress issues, and there's a lot of suicides too. And we've got a former law enforcement professional in our caucus, Jacqueline Maycumber, who's our floor leader. She's proposing a suite of bills that will provide more training and more support. I've had lots of law enforcement groups come in and talk with us. We need to do a couple of things. We need to provide more training. We always need to hold law enforcement to the highest possible standard, and I believe that they are nearly unanimous in feeling that way themselves. And then at the same time, we have to use our bully pulpit to support them, so that they don't feel like everything bad that happens is their fault. And sometimes that happens.
Okay. Just a couple minutes left here. I do want to ask you about Representative Matt Shea. This has taken up a lot of your bandwidth. There was an investigation into his actions, findings. You suspended him from your caucus. He's been removed from committee assignments. First, you've also been threatened as a result of this online, and as I understand it, I think the Seattle Times reported that the Washington State Patrol is even looking into those threats. You've come under fire from fellow Republicans. Where do things stand, and how is your decision to remove him from the caucus sitting with you and your caucus?
Well, I'm not experiencing second thoughts about that. And I think my caucus is pretty solid, but I'm the leader, and it's my job to take the slings and arrows for decisions that we make. And so I'm willing to do that. In public life, you get threats, and there's not many people that have been elected that haven't had some experience with that. Where things stand now, he's suspended. Everything that you said there was accurate. You know, there's been some question about whether the report is flawed, and I agree it's flawed because Representative Shea didn't take part in it. And I would like to try to find a way where first of all, the public could be exposed to the evidence.
And it sounds like there's a plan to release at least some of it.
There is, but it's still pretty opaque when you start with a 108-page report. And I've talked to a lot of people that, you know, have an opinion but just haven't read it. And, you know, I'd like to find a way for Matt to answer those things. And so I think that there may be some more information coming out, and I would hope that he would want to address the facts.
But barring a plan on the part of House Democrats to try to expel him, it seems like there would be unlikely to be any sort of hearings or other process put in place. Do you have a proposal in mind? Because you guys have indicated that you're not inclined to support expulsion.
Yeah, I've said quite a few times that it's up to the people inside the building to decide how we're going to organize ourselves in caucuses, et cetera, but it's up to the voters to decide who's going to be in the building. But that doesn't mean that we can't have some kind of a question and answer process, and I'd like to work creatively to do something like that.
Is something in the works?
Not right now.
Okay. In the minute we have left, where at the end of 60 days, how do you gauge success or failure as a member of as the leader of the minority caucus?
Well, I think with working on a 10-year perspective now, the thing that is most notable to me is that there's been a couple of major areas where we took things on as priorities, and instead of fixing them, we broke them. And I think one of the most glaring is the fact that we've broken the system that allowed teachers and administrators to evenly bargain. Any administrator will tell you that we don't have an even playing field when it comes to that negotiation now. And I really regret having been here while that happened. The other thing that I think we've broken has been the child care system. It's less available and more expensive after lots of legislative action. So my first priority is let's not break the housing system, for example, any more than it's already broken. And I would really caution all the new members that are here, think hard about the consequences of what you do, because when you pass a bill, there's no guarantee that it's going to help.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there. House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox, thanks very much for coming in to talk with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Austin.
And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.